The MIT report, The Limits to Growth, argued that the overuse of environmental resources is related to the exponential growth of population and economic growth, referring most to industrial activities, causing the exhaustion of those resources and environmental degradation. A second factor is very important to explain environmental degradation. They are the environmental hazards and disasters. Disasters are the results of hazards. Disasters create devastating short-term and long-term impacts on a community, on a region, or in a nation, affecting humans' lives, property, employment, infrastructure, and the natural environment. What do we mean exactly by environmental disaster? We will use a definition done by the United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. They define disasters as a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society involving widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses and impacts, which exceeds the ability of the affected community or society to cope with its own resources. This definition is very interesting because it highlights that an environmental disaster impact is thus a function of two factors. The first factor is an external force of disruption, and the second factor is an internal capacity to cope with its consequences. The academic literature points out that there are many kinds of environmental hazards, but mainly they are categorized into three types: natural, technological, and context hazards. The natural are considered the extreme geophysical and biological events: earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, landslides, tornadoes, epidemic diseases. Also, technological hazards encompass transport accidents, train crashes, industrial failures, explosions and fires, release of toxic or radioactive materials, unsafe public buildings, misuse of hazardous materials, and the context hazards, such as global environmental change, international air pollution, climate change, sea level rise, environmental degradation such as deforestation, desertification, land pressure, urbanization, concentration of basic facilities. In a distant past, disasters were interpreted as acts of God, as divine punishment, but not anymore. There is a long time we already know that. First, hazards and disasters are two sides of the same coin. They cannot be fully explained only from the standpoint of physical sciences, not from the only approach of the social sciences. Nature and society are interconnected, so any change in one has the potential to affect the other. Second, humans are not simply the victims of hazards. Human actions contribute to hazardous processes and to disaster outcomes. For example, human actions that overexploit and degrade natural resources through processes like deforestation and global warming, in turn, amplify the risk related to, for instance, river floods and sea level rise. Third, the losses due to disasters are not equally distributed among everybody. There are people much more vulnerable to disasters than others. Just take a look at the news regarding recent disasters such as earthquake and tsunami in Japan or the Hurricane Katrina in the United States, New Orleans. This distribution is influenced by social and political factors, and this issue leads us to a very important theme of environmental justice. We will come back to this notion in the next lessons. Several disasters have generated worldwide attention recently. Some became catastrophic, resulting in unimaginable casualties, deaths, and property damage. They are not a novelty for the humankind. The different thing is their number, their nature, their magnitude, and the human responsibility on them, and the harm caused by all those 20th century hazards, which makes them unprecedented in history. When we address the subject, we get horrified and tend to move away rapidly. But it's important to remember some of them and keep them in mind because they are very significative to the environmental policy agenda. Some examples now. The most outrageous disaster, in my opinion, is the nuclear tragedy in Hiroshima and Nagasaki that occurred in August 1945. The United States detonated 2 atomic bombs over these 2 Japanese cities, and the bombings killed between 100,000 and 200,000 people, most of them civilians. It remains the only use of nuclear weapons in an armed conflict up to date. In 1952, smog in London, a severe air pollution event over the city, lasted for 5 days, killed immediately 4,000 people. This was most caused from the use of coal. 1 year later, 1953, again, smog in New York City, a heavy cloud of soot and lead, killed immediately 200 people. In 1956, it was officially discovered the mercury poisoning of villagers in Minamata, Japan. The poisoning came from the local seafood, which had absorbed mercury dumped into the sea by an industrial plant. Hundreds eventually died, and hundreds more were born with brain damage and other birth defects. In 1984, the Bhopal tragedy occurred in Madhya Pradesh, India. 40 tons of toxic substances leaked from a pesticide factory of the American company Union Carbide. More than 500,000 people, most workers, were exposed to these gases, and at least 27,000 died in a short term. Union Carbide refused to provide detailed information about the nature of the contaminants that leaked, and as a result, doctors were unable to adequately treat exposed individuals. Nowadays, many sources state that there was a leakage of 27 tons of the deadly gas methyl isocyanate. This is one of the worst industrial disasters and astonishing example of corporate crime. In 1986, April, a nuclear accident occurred in the nuclear power plant built by the Soviet Union 20 kilometers from the city of Chernobyl in the north of the then called Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. This nuclear plant was built in the mid-70s, and a reactor at the Chernobyl plant exploded, releasing an immense radioactive cloud contaminating people, animals, and the environment across Europe. Ironically, the accident occurred while testing a safety mechanism. In 1989, our sixth example, the Exxon corporate tanker Exxon Valdez on March spilled about 50,000 cubic meters of crude oil in the sea. As a result of this spill, thousands of animals died. In the following months, according to estimates, about 250,000 seabirds, 250 eagles, billions of salmon eggs, and uncountable fish. Those events brought many questions to researchers. Among them, there is Ulrich Beck, who coined the term the risk society. Ulrich Beck is considered the most representative sociologist of a generation for whom the current environmental crisis put at risk the survival of the human species. Beck argued that there is a shift from industrial to risk societies. The industrial society for him was based upon industry and social classes, upon welfare states, and upon the distribution of various goods organized and distributed through the state, especially good health, extensive education, and equitable forms of social welfare. By contrast, The concept of risk society is based on the importance of the beds. Risk societies involve the distribution of beds that flow within and across various territories and are not confined within the borders of a single society, of a single nation. Modern technology creates new threats whose effects interact among themselves. For example, nuclear radiation. They cannot be confined into any specific space nor into any current sector of time. Such risks, thus, cannot be insured against. They are uncontrolled and the consequences incalculable. They have largely resulted from the actions of people, state officials, scientists, technologies, corporations, decision makers, treating the world as a laboratory. It is difficult to foresee all the consequences, and it's not easy to determine what is an acceptable risk. The notion of risk and the environmental risk assessment are one of the key categories in environmental policy and represents a challenge, as we will discuss in the next classes.